Woody Allen has said, "I don't know the question, but sex is definitely the answer." Yeah, that's true. Sex is all around us. And that makes it very natural that we have an evening at ELF about sex. But it's also a huge challenge because we come individually from so many different directions when we think about sex. For some of us, it's not a big issue. We are focusing on other questions. For some of us, sex is an area of frustration and maybe pain and shame. And for others, sex is just a positive factor of life, of intimacy and joy. So in many aspects, this is a subject that is better suited for a personal conversation where we can share our struggles and share our life stories. But there is also a need for a public conversation about the Christian understanding of sex. So I think there is a need for an evening about sex. Now, the culture around us often tries to silence us. They say, "Relax, why are you so obsessed with all things sexual?" That is such a strange accusation, since the culture talks about sex all the time. We are bombarded by sexual messages all the time. It's a strange thing that everyone else would have the freedom to express their view on sex, except for the Christian. So of course, we should also contribute to the public discussion about sex with our understanding. Another accusation, which aims also to silence us, is to say, "Oh, you're hypocrites." Well, there's some truth to that. And we need to be humble here. But we also need to do some clear thinking. What is a hypocrite? Well, you are not a hypocrite just by affirming a moral principle and then failing to live up to it yourself. Well, then you are a sinner, yes, but not necessarily a hypocrite. A hypocrite is someone who affirms a moral principle, judge other people according to it, and pretend to pass the test oneself, even though one is actually breaking it. So this is an issue of being honest about the mess in one's own life, being humble in relationship to other people, and being humble in relationship to the moral affirmation one is doing. I'm deeply marked by John's Gospel, chapter 8, when there's a lot of people surrounding a sexually compromised woman. And then Jesus says, "Let anyone of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone." And I'm not here to throw any stones at all. My point so far is to say there are good reasons for us to have also a public conversation about sex. Let me put my cards on the table. I come to this subject from three different perspectives. The first perspective is the perspective of design. I'm interested in what it is to be a bodily, sexual human being. I'm not interested in an arbitrary set of moral principles. I'm not that interested in tradition, in principles, just because they have been with us for a very long time. And I'm not interested in something just because it's written in a book. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean this. Even if the Bible didn't say one word about our sexuality, it would still be true that we are designed. And I am really interested in trying to find out the thinking behind that design. The second perspective I'm coming from is the perspective of the Bible, because the Bible do speak about sexuality, and it put into words the meaning of God's design. And as a Christian, I'm obliged to listen to and to obey God's word. The God who speaks to us in the Bible is the God who, in the first place, designed us and created us. And the Bible is his explanation of that design. And of course, the theme of this evening is the Bible's revolutionary view of sex. So we will return to the biblical texts. And thirdly, I come to the subject of sex from the perspective of the gospel. That means I come to it from a framework of hope. In the gospel, we are offered redemption from our own history. We can be cleansed from our sins. We can have forgiveness and a new start, and we are given the Holy Spirit who will guide us into a new life. This means that we can talk about sex without being imprisoned by our past or discouraged about the future. If you want me to put this into more theological categories, design has to do with creation, the Bible has to do with revelation, and the gospel has to do with salvation and restoration of the human being. Now, after these introductory remarks, my presentations will have two main points, both focusing on a revolution. First, the sexual revolution. When you think about the sexual revolution, it's natural to think about Sweden in the 60s, because we took the lead in what's commonly called the sexual revolution. But you need to go beyond that, to Berlin and Vienna in the 1920s, to the free thinkers during the 19th century, and actually all the way back to the Enlightenment in the early 19th century. You have to go back to Marquis de Sade, who is called the founder of eroticism. Now, let me first say that the time of Marquis de Sade was not a golden age for sexual ethics. Not at all. It was a problematic age. There were brothels all over Europe. Men were using women and just throwing them away when they became pregnant and did not take care of them or the children. There was really a need for a sexual revolution. But it was not those kinds of problems that Marquis de Sade were addressing. No, he took the Enlightenment philosophy to its logical conclusion. For Marquis de Sade, there was no God, and therefore there was no moral values, no design, no purpose, no goal for human life. Everything was completely open. And you can summarize his life view with the words of Alexander Pope: whatever is right. There is no limitation for what can be done and what can be allowed to be done sexually. And Marquis de Sade practiced that in his own life. This kind of thinking was picked up in the 1920s and 30s by the Austrian psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich. He is the one who coined the term the sexual revolution. It's the title of his 1936 book. And Wilhelm Reich, he said, a sexual revolution is in progress and no power on earth will stop it. And so far, he seems always be right in that prophecy. The sexual revolution he was formulating was a revolution that wanted to see life and sex as identical. To quote him, the pleasure of living and the pleasure of the orgasm are identical. Human life is about sex. The physical satisfaction as such, that is human life, the point of human life. And he penned a program for this sexual revolution. He wanted to see the abolition of lifelong monogamous marriage. He wanted to encourage infantile and adolescent sexuality. You could have sex all through your life from childhood all the way through. He saw suppression of your sexual urge, your sexual drive, as destructive, and abstinence from sex as pathological, as something sick. And he wanted the category of perversion, sexual perversion, to be eliminated. There can't be anything that is wrong, that is outside the realm of what is permitted, what is good, what is natural. He wanted that to be eliminated. And if you look at that list, his revolution has really succeeded, with one exception. Of course, we draw still a strong line against pedophilia. We don't want to involve children in sexual activities. But on all the other points, it is so much of Wilhelm Reich thinking that is driving our culture. We have chosen to separate sex from marriage, separate sex from love, separate sex from permanence, separate sex from procreation, and eventually, finally, separate sex from our own physical body. And we want to have the freedom to define and redefine ourselves regardless of our own body. What has been the consequences of this? A lot of people have never heard of Marquis de Sade or don't know about Wilhelm Reich, but they've heard about the sexual revolution and they have had great hopes for the sexual revolution. It has, during the 20th century, been viewed as something that will liberate human beings, that will liberate sexuality and liberate life. Love will flourish if we just take away all those limits. Our dreams will come true if we just follow the sexual revolution. Well, what has been the consequences? Well, they are obvious for everyone who wants to see and everyone who wants to study statistics. Family stability is destroyed. 50% of all marriages are breaking down, and we have a chaos in terms of close relationships. Human life is devalued. If you take just the 4 countries of UK, France, Germany, and Spain, every year over 600,000 unborn babies are killed. That is a result of course, sexual acts, but we don't care about the consequences. You can think of health issues. Sexually transmitted disease are spreading like wildfire and are destroying so much. And all the promises of a liberation for men and women, for love and sexuality, has proven to be false. Francis Fukuyama, most well known for his book The End of History, he wrote later on a book called The Great Disruption. And in that book, he goes through the last 50 years, which is called the Great Disruption, where the social order is disrupted in the Western world. And here is his words. One of the greatest frauds perpetrated during the Great Disruption was the notion that the sexual revolution was gender neutral, benefiting women and men equally, and that it somehow had a kinship with the feminist revolution. In fact, the sexual revolution served the interests of men, and in the end put sharp limits on the gains that women might otherwise have expected from their liberation from traditional roles. This has not benefited women. And that became so obvious in the global Me Too movement. The new sexual freedom has been used by men, and they have used women. Very selfish. So, we could have looked into many other aspects and seen that the sexual revolution has not delivered on its promises. There is a need for a better way. So, my second main point, the Bible's revolutionary view of sex. I think it's time to give the Christian faith and the biblical teaching a second chance to be heard and try to understand its perspective on what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a sexual being. The natural starting point here is, of course, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the two chapters on creation of the universe, creation of humankind, creation of male and female. And if you ask the question, why sex? You will have three very obvious answers. Sex has been given to us for procreation. We are called to be co-creators with God. We are involved in this huge enterprise of this creation. We can be the origin of new human beings, to receive a new human being and to help that new person into life and help them to grow and develop. What an honorable task. Secondly, sex is not only for procreation, it's also a sign of unity. There is a relational, a communicative aspect of sex, that it brings a man and a woman together in a deep and unique unity. And then, which is just assumed because of the way God has created us, this is connected with joy and pleasure. So there is a biological component. We are God's co-creators. We create, He creates through us. So there is a biological component, there is a relational component of a man and a woman being united, and there is a sensual dimension of joy and pleasure. It is those two chapters that Jesus turns to when people are bringing up issues on marriage, divorce, sexuality. In Matthew 19, Jesus quotes and combines some verses from chapter 1 in Genesis and some verses from chapter 2. And I read, "Have you not read that He who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" That's a quotation from Genesis 1. "And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." That is a quotation from Genesis 2. And then Jesus adds, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Whatever God has joined together, let not man separate." So, here is the explanation from God's side of why we are male and female, bodily and sexually beings. In this passage, especially in the passage from Genesis chapter 2, you can say God gives us a definition of marriage. And that definition is that marriage is a monogamous relationship between a man and his wife. It is a heterosexual relationship between a man and his wife. It is a relationship that starts with a change of a social status. You create a new human being. You leave your mother and father, and something new is established. And it is assumed that this new unit is built upon lifelong fidelity. You are to hold fast, to be glued to each other. And this new relationship is completed in the sexual union. You become one flesh. And whenever you study the Bible, when it talks about sex, it takes for granted that the sexual expression belongs to marriage, to this covenant between a man and a woman. The marriage is actually talked about as a covenant. For example, in Malachi 2, it speaks of your wife by a covenant. That is a very special sort of relationship. It's not a general agreement where you can rewrite the rules. It's something much, much deeper. This covenant, according to the Christian faith, is created by public promises, and it is confirmed in the sexual union. A marriage is not established by two people having sex. No, a marriage is established by covenant promises before witnesses, and then that promise of being united to the other person is confirmed in the sexual union. When you say with your body what you have been prepared to publicly say with your mouth. In the New Testament, it says, marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure. Now, this is, of course, a very different understanding of sex than in the surrounding culture. And many people have strong reaction against the thought of keeping sex exclusively to the marriage relationship. But if you start to think about it, it is not that strange a view. It's actually the consequence of taking seriously what we all know about sex. What do I mean? I mean this. Sex is a unique bodily act, and we all know it. It's not an act comparable to other physical acts. Even in our laws, and that's true for all countries, you make a distinction between physical assault and rape. Why is that? Rape, it's just a physical assault. It's just a specific body parts touching a specific body part. Why should you make a distinction between that and having someone punching you in the stomach or on the mouth? Well, we all know why. Sex is a unique and much deeper act than any other physical act. So it's not surprising that there is a unique context for a unique physical act. When people, even in a culture marked by the sexual revolution, where they have had many different sexual relationships, and then they finally find the love of their life, and they enter into a marriage, then suddenly everyone accepts that sex has a unique function in that relationship. And unfaithfulness, sexual unfaithfulness, threatens the whole relationship. Because then everyone views sex as a covenantal sign, as something that underlines the uniqueness of the relationship between the man and the woman. It is a sign of exclusive belonging. And the Christian faith just says that this fact that everyone accepts as soon as they enter into a marriage, we should just have a coherent view and apply the same view all through our life. That sex is this unique sign of belonging. It is this covenantal sign. It's an incoherent position we have in our culture where we in some parts of our lives, view sex as nothing special, nothing unique, and then suddenly, in another context, see it as this unique and deeply different kind of physical act. In the movie Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz, there is a dialogue between David, played by Tom Cruise, and one of his girlfriends, Julie, played by Cameron Diaz. And Julie is very disappointed with the unfaithfulness of David. And she says, "Don't you know that when you sleep with someone, your body makes a promise whether you do or not?" That is actually a profound truth. This understanding of sexuality needs to be put into the larger view of life you find in the Christian faith. So according to the Christian faith, sex is good, but it's not ultimate. It is not the thing that defines our human existence. So according to the Christian faith, marriage is good and sex within marriage is really a good thing. But singleness is good. And celibacy, to abstain from sexual expression when you are not married, is a good thing. It's all about different callings we had, where those different callings have a common goal: to express what it means to be the image of God, to love God and to love our neighbor, and to live for the glory of God and for His kingdom. For some, it's the same calling all through their life. For some, you have the calling of singleness for some period, the calling of marriage for some period of your life, and again, after the death of a spouse, for example, the calling of singleness again. So this differs, but it's two equally valid callings where you can glorify God and you can be a blessing to other people. So we need to put sex and marriage into this broader context of human life. What I've said here stand, of course, in a stark contrast to the surrounding culture. And of course, there's so many other issues I should have addressed, and so many questions that are provoked by this kind of presentation. I'm obviously aware of that and would love to address those questions, but I do not have the time. But because there is such a stark contrast between the Christian view and the surrounding culture, too many Christians become silent on these issues. Then it's important to see even further back in history, beyond Marquis de Sade and the sexual revolution that followed from him. If we go back to the early Christians, they lived in the Roman Empire in a culture that was even further away from a Christian understanding of sex. And that was the culture where the Christian church first was planted and started to grow. How did they relate to the surrounding culture in terms of sexuality? In the book From Shame to Sin, Kyle Harper goes through the growth of the Christian movement, and he also addresses how the first generations of Christians were dealing with this issue. And he says, "The most astonishing development of late antiquity is the transformation of a radical sexual ideology, for centuries the possession of a small strident band of vociferous dissenters, into a culture, a broadly shared public framework of values and meanings." So it's astonishing that the Christian view that originally was held just by a small band of people gradually took over the whole culture. How did that happen? Well, here is his answer. In the early centuries, the Christian leadership spoke in an apologetic key. This fact shaped the entire tonal arrangement of early Christian moralizing. And we need to do the same today. Not to excuse the Christian view, not to hide it, But we need to start to speak about the Christian understanding of the human being also from an apologetic perspective, meaning to explain the content of the Christian view and to defend the truth, the goodness, and the beauty of the Christian view.